We might create an impressive structure today, but tomorrow it will be nothing but a fragile remnant of forgotten memories, barely holding it together just as long as nature allows it. A ruin is a reminder that nature takes everything back without judgment or prejudice. That is what I attempted to show in this little vignette of an age-old ruin of a brick building engulfed by a mighty fig tree. Today, in part 1 of this two-part series, I'm going to show you how to create convincing brick walls of a ruin using nothing but air-dry clay and some watercolor. My inspiration for this little piece was the ruins of the Ross Island, a posh little settlement built by India's colonial masters as the administrative township that oversaw the infamous cellular jail, one of the most fearsome prisons in human history, right across the small channel. Once called the Paris of the East, the bricks and stones of this little island witnessed some dark times, yet nature healed it all with abundance of green and life. The HO-scale interpretation would be built on a 5-inch diameter round base. This project was basically a careful experiment to explore some new techniques and build an understanding of the subject for a bigger project later. So if you haven't done it already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified about part 2 of this series and other exciting future episodes. To build the walls, first I had built a frame using scrap piece of floorboard and a few pieces of styrene. Then I took some air-drying sculpting clay, added a little bit of water, and kneaded the clay to bring it to a workable form. I took a rolling pin and flattened the clay in the frame. The idea here is to get a 1 mm thick rectangular sheet of clay. The frames on the sides ensured that the pressure from the rolling pin is equally distributed so that the clay sheet is uniformly thick. I took a see-through straight edge and started scribing straight parallel lines on the soft clay. The lines were 2.5 mm apart. Then I made myself a scribing tool with a thin 2.5 mm wide edge from a copper sheet. This was used to scribe vertical lines 5 mm apart between two long parallel lines with 2.5 mm offset between alternate sets. This made it look like a basic brick pattern. However, this was not intended to be the final look. I merely used these as guides so that scribing the actual brick patterns is easier later. Notice that I'm keeping a wet tissue on the surface that I'm not working on actively to keep the clay from drying up. I made an L-shaped punching tool out of metal sheets to cut out the windows. On the wet clay, it was just a matter of placing the tool square with the lines and pressing it gently. For two large windows with arches, I used another thin metal sheet that is formed in a semicircular shape. Once I was satisfied with the windows, I spliced the sheet to get the two walls that I needed. Now, these old brick buildings had at least 2 layers of bricks. To simulate that, I made another sheet of clay following the same steps. I pressed these walls on the new sheet as it was still wet, essentially joining the two sections. Then I trimmed the edges of the second layer and cut the windows using the same tools. After the windows were formed, I used the same techniques to make the basic guidelines, which in itself look like large bricks laid in running bond fashion. Now, you might be wondering why I'm taking so much trouble when there are so many readily available plastic brick patterns in the market. The answer is that the plastic brick would be perfect if I were making a model of a normal city building. But for a ruined diorama, the natural texture of clay and, as we'll see later, the ingrained fragility of these thin layers are going to add that extra realism and randomness of a ruin which is not possible using plastic sheets. That is why I'm even using 2 separate layers here instead of one 2 mm thick sheet. Once the basic patterns and shapes were done, the walls were left dry completely. In fact, for several weeks, since I was busy making other models and commission projects in between, as you might have already seen in my recent videos and Instagram posts. When I came back to the wall, I started by carving the smaller bricks using the guides already in place. An imperial brick in HO scale would come close to a dimension of 2.6 mm by 1.25 mm and 0.75 mm. Now it is impossible to get that precision in hand-carved models consistently, so I decided to go for a standard round-off of 2.5 mm, 1.25 mm and 1 mm. If you halve the dimensions of my guide, you get the same measurements of length, height and depth. I started by scribing the long straight lines at the middle of the two guides. The existing lines were not perfectly straight, so often it was a freehand scribe. Next, I took a blade with a broken tip and scribed the longitudinal lines. The broken tip had a dimension of approximately 1 mm, which made it easier for me to keep uniform lines of the grooves that stayed within the boundary. I followed an English bond pattern, which means one row to show the bricks longitudinally with 2.5 mm length, while the next shows the width of 1.2 mm and continues in alternate rows. Now notice that freehand scribing did make these dimensions uneven, and in many cases it also broke the edges and bricks in some places. This is the effect that I was after. I wanted these bricks to show aging, breaks, fracture lines, weak joints, and all the flaws that you can expect to see in a ruin. In the photos you can see how naturally the different colors have blended on the brick walls. Aging, stress, discoloration, dust and earth, moss, it's all mixed in a random fashion. So I took my wife's suggestion and decided to use watercolor for painting the walls. Watercolors have a unique benefit over acrylic, especially on a porous surface such as clay. It's easy to create the subtle blend of the colors and use its natural transparency to its full potential. First, I give it a thorough coat of English red as the base. This also blends the natural tone of the clay, and the porous nature of the clay helps retain that rough, brick-like texture. Then, I applied a black wash to darken the crevices and give the brick some aging and shade. Notice the swatch card as the reference for this particular set. Keeping that handy is critical for your success if you're using watercolor as a medium. Next, I wanted to add some greenish gray. For that, I mixed purple and sap green to make that muddy, mossy gray. This gray was then applied in random fashion on the wall. I modulated the green to denote various shades of moss. Keeping the application natural and random is the trick. Notice how the transparency of the color helps blend all these different and often contrasting tones into natural transitions. No brick wall is complete without individually darkened bricks. I mixed black and white to make flat gray and used burnt sienna right off the pan to make darker tones and painted individual bricks. Watercolors on clay brought surprisingly natural tones of the bricks, and it was really one of the easiest things to achieve in this whole project. I'm denoting this as my top discovery of 2020. Now, two important architectural elements were missing in the building so far: lintels for the square windows and arches for the arch ones. I decided to tackle the arch ones first. I took some little bricks which were the byproduct of the wall and then glued them in place one piece at a time. It took some effort but was really a necessary addition. For the lintels, I cut square grooves on the two top corners of each of the square windows. The existing brick alignment made it pretty easy to keep it clean. Once the arches and lintel grooves were done, I blended everything back with the rest of the structure using the same techniques I used to paint the walls. I decided to use wooden lintels for the windows. I took a 3 mm square balsa rod, cut appropriate lengths for each of the windows, shaped as necessary, and put them in the groove. To paint the lintels, first I used black wood stain to darken the wood. Then I used a bit of brown wood stain to highlight those grooves and rough edges. Lastly, a bit of gray to age the wood appropriately. For the base of the building, I went for 3 mm thick PVC foam board, which will sit on top of the round base of a 5-inch dome. First, I used low-grit sandpaper to roughen it up to create the texture of old concrete base. Then grooves were made for the walls to sit. It was cut to a 90-degree pie shape to fit the round base, and the edges were beveled out to blend it with the scenery later on. I used light gray spray paint as the base on top of black primer for the concrete color and texture. Once dried, I used off-white and light gray paint to dry brush some subtle variations and highlights. Wet modeling clay paste was poured in the grooves to secure the walls. Then all contacting surfaces of the wall received beads of white glue before it was fixed on the base and clamped down. I used other broken pieces of the wall and individual bricks to make broken walls and debris on the inside of the building. Then I got my watercolor set back and used the same color scheme to blend everything to one tone. I used a greenish tone on the ground and on the bricks near the ground to denote heavier concentration of moss, a common phenomena in a long abandoned building in a small island in the middle of the sea. The concrete base along with the walls was then glued down to the diorama base. This is essentially a two-element project. The large tree that I was yet to build at this point is the main subject of the sculpture, whereas the broken walls of the ruin would be the key contrasting object to base the tree on. We are done with one, and in the next episode, I'm going to show you how to turn this into a mesmerizing diorama by using just a few pieces of wire, a piece of jute card, modeling paste, and some paint. Stay tuned and have fun making miniatures.